Hey guys, tonight we begin with the most dangerous job in the Vietnam War, that of the helicopter door gunner. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights and let us ease into tonight's journey together. Welcome, everyone, to the Channel Historian Podcast. November 27th, 1968. It was Thanksgiving Day over Firebase Sierra, deep in the central highlands of Vietnam. Specialist for Robert Sohn watched through the open door of the UH-1 Huey helicopter as tracers carved lazy, hypnotic red lines through the morning mist. His M60 machine gun hung from a web of bungee cords, the barrel still warm from the previous insertion. He was 23 years old, barely 2 months in country, and he had already learned the one thing that training back in the world never taught him. In a helicopter flying at 1,500 feet over a hostile jungle, there is no cover. There is no concealment. There is only the wide open door, the screaming wind, and an enemy below with weapons pointed upward. The mathematics of survival were brutally simple. Over 10% of all Vietnam War casualties were helicopter crew members. Of the 6,175 Americans who died in helicopter operations, 2,704 were air crew. And among those air crew, the door gunners represented the highest casualty rate of any aviation position. They sat in open doorways, completely exposed, armed with 30-pound machine guns, tasked with suppressing enemy fire, while their aircraft hovered at the single most vulnerable moment of flight, the landing. What none of them knew during those first terrifying insertions was that they were not just fighting an enemy. They were fighting physics, they were fighting tactics, and they were fighting a fundamental truth about helicopter warfare that would take the Army years to fully understand. The door gunner position was not designed to be survivable. It was designed to be effective. And effectiveness in the cold calculus of war often demands sacrifice. The journey to understanding why Dr. Gunners did not survive Vietnam begins not in the jungles of Southeast Asia, but in the design requirements of the Bell UH-1 Iroquois helicopter. When the United States Army first deployed the Huey to Vietnam in 1962, it arrived as a utility helicopter. It was unarmored, it was lightly armed, and it was built for medical evacuation and troop transport in what military planners assumed would be a very limited advisory role. Historians still debate the precise moment the planners in Washington realized this advisory role was a complete fantasy. But for the crews flying those first missions, the reality was immediate and violent. The original HU-1 designation stood for helicopter utility. The crews, always good with nicknames, quickly shortened that to Huey, and the name stuck. It is a friendly sort of name for a machine that would become the defining symbol of a brutal war. Those early Hueys flew without any dedicated door guns. The crews had to improvise, grabbing whatever weapons they could mount or just hold. Soldiers held M1 carbines, M14 rifles, and eventually M16 rifles out the door, desperately hoping to suppress the ground fire coming up at them. Imagine the feeling of that. The immense deafening roar of the single turbine engine just overhead, the percussive chop-chop of the main rotor blades vibrating through the thin aluminum floor and up into your bones. The air smells of hot metal, jet fuel, and damp, green jungle rot, even from this high up. You are trying to aim a rifle while kneeling in a doorway, fighting a 100-knot wind that rips the breath from your lungs. The concept of a dedicated door gunner as an official position arose from this exact necessity, not from any intelligent planning. As helicopter insertions into contested landing zones, or LZs, became routine, crews discovered they needed overwhelming, continuous, suppressive fire. they needed it most during that most vulnerable phase of flight. Those final 30 seconds of descent, when the helicopter slowed, steadied, and hovered just 3 feet above the ground while the troops jumped out. This tiny window of time, this hovering pause, was a death sentence waiting to be signed. By 1963, the M60 7.62mm machine gun became the standard equipment on both sides of the Huey. This was a true beast of a weapon. The M60 weighed 24 pounds unloaded. When you add the ammunition, a door gunner was managing over 200 pounds of weapon system. This gun could fire up to 700 rounds per minute. Though in practice, gunners learned to fire in controlled bursts. They had to conserve ammunition while maintaining that crucial suppressive fire. The weapon was mounted on a pintle at first, which is just a swiveling post that gave a very limited range of motion. As the war progressed, crews ditched the pintle mounts and switched to bungee cords suspended from the cabin ceiling. These simple, elastic cords supported the heavy weight of the gun while allowing the gunner full freedom of movement. This evolution, like so many in Vietnam, seemed like a brilliant improvement. More flexibility meant better coverage of the ground. Better coverage meant more effective suppressive fire. But it also meant something else. Something much darker. It meant the door gunner had to lean farther out of the aircraft to engage targets. It meant more exposure, more vulnerability. The very adaptation that made them more effective also made them much, much easier to kill. Warrant Officer John Masaki arrived in Vietnam in 1968. He was assigned to a UH-1C gunship unit, and he had completed both door gunner's school and crew chief school stateside. He learned how to maintain the helicopter's complex systems and how to operate the M60. But nothing in that training, nothing at all, prepared him for the reality of Vietnam. In a later interview, he described his first combat insertion. The noise inside the helicopter made conversation completely impossible. There was the vibration from the rotor blades above, the scream of the engine, and the wind. A constant howling force that ripped through the open cabin. Then the aircraft commander gave the signal, and they descended toward the landing zone. The door gunners on each side opened fire. Masaki squeezed the trigger, and the M60 roared to life in his hands. Spent casings and belt links ejected into a canvas bag attached to the gun. A simple but vital feature to prevent the metal bits from being sucked into the rotor system or falling like hot rain on the troops below. He aimed at the tree line, watching his tracers. Every fifth round glowed red, arcing toward the jungle. You fire before you see the enemy. You fire to keep the enemy suppressed. You fire because the moment you stop firing is the moment they have time to aim. The sound of incoming fire was totally different from outgoing fire. Outgoing fire had a rhythm, a purpose you controlled. Incoming fire just cracked past the aircraft with random, chaotic energy. Masaki heard rounds snap past his head, a sound like a bullwhip. He saw the thin aluminum skin of the helicopter puncture, daylight appearing in small, neat holes. One round came up through the floor, missing him by inches. He learned later that specific round had lodged in the Bible of the soldier sitting next to him. The helicopter completed the insertion and climbed out, banking hard. Masaki checked himself. No wounds. But the mission was not over. They would fly 12 more insertions just like it that same day. The concept of the hot landing zone defined the door gunner experience. A hot LZ meant the enemy was actively engaging the helicopters as they landed. In theory, this was a survivable event. Artillery would prep the zone first, pounding the area with high explosive shells, turning the earth over and hopefully keeping the enemy's heads down. Then, helicopter gunships, the mean-looking Cobras or armed Hueys, would make rocket runs. They would fire 70-millimeter rockets that shrieked as they flew and unleashed minigun bursts. A sound like a giant canvas being torn, pouring thousands of rounds into the tree lines. Finally, the slicks, the troop carrying Hueys like Masakis, would come in. 8 to 10 helicopters in a single formation, carrying 60 to 80 soldiers in total. The door gunners on these slicks would open fire as they descended, suppressing any remaining enemy positions. In theory, this massive, coordinated application of violence reduced the risk. In practice, the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong learned to wait. They were patient, and they were smart. They dug fighting positions with overhead cover, strong enough to withstand the artillery. They positioned troops in concealed locations with clear, pre-sighted fields of fire aimed directly at the landing zone. They learned the helicopter approach patterns, and most critically, they learned to concentrate their fire on the helicopters themselves rather than on the troops they carried. A downed helicopter was a strategic prize. It meant a crashed aircraft, probably wounded or dead crew. It was a valuable prize to be captured or destroyed. It also meant that other helicopters would have to attempt a rescue, flying back into the same kill zone, creating even more targets. Specialist for Thomas Pina flew as co-pilot on Chalk 2 during an insertion near the Cambodian border. The flight lead, the first helicopter in the formation, called the landing zone clear. No enemy contact. Chalk 1, the flight lead, landed successfully. Chalk 2, Pina's aircraft, began its final approach. Then the tree line erupted. It was not just one or two rifles. It was a coordinated ambush. The sound was terrifying. First, the distinctively sharp, high-pitched cracks of AK-47 fire. Then, the slower, heavier thud-thud of a heavy machine gun, probably a 12. 7mm DSK, the weapon Americans called a 51 caliber. Then came the sound that every crewman dreaded, the whoosh of an RPG-7 rocket, recognizable by its fiery trail of smoke. The door gunner on Pina's aircraft returned fire immediately, his M60 hammering. The crew chief on the other side did the same. But an RPG streaked toward them. It missed by feet, exploding in the trees just beyond the aircraft. The concussion alone felt like a physical blow, a wave of hot, sulfurous air washing over the open cabin, making the helicopter shudder. Small arms fire tore through the thin aluminum skin. The Huey, as we know, had minimal armor. The pilot sat in armored seats, but only because lessons learned from previous casualties had demanded it. The door gunners had no such protection. They wore flak vests, which were designed to stop low-velocity shrapnel, not high-velocity rifle rounds. Some wore ceramic body armor plates, nicknamed chicken plates. This was the odd, almost comical solution to a deadly problem. A 22-pound piece of curved ceramic, shaped like a dinner plate, worn inside the flak jacket. Historians still debate the effectiveness of the chicken plate, but most veterans agreed it was better than nothing, even if it only covered a small portion of the chest. It did not cover the arms, the legs, the neck, or the head. It was just 22 pounds of hope. Pina's helicopter took multiple hits. He heard the distinctive sound of rounds punching through the aluminum, a noise like a fist hitting a metal garbage can. He felt the helicopter shudder as hydraulic lines were severed. The aircraft commander fought the controls, but the Huey was dying. They lost altitude rapidly and crashed short of the landing zone. Pina survived with serious injuries. The door gunner did not. An AK-47 round had struck him in the head during the descent. He was 19 years old, and he had been in country for 3 months. The exposure factor defined door gunner mortality, and this vulnerability was locked in by the weapon system itself. Remember that Warrant Officer Masaki was using a bungee cord system. This was not some random field repair. It was a critical and ultimately fatal evolution. The official solution for mounting the M60 was the M67 system. This was an Army-designated kit that included a pintle mount, which is a rigid metal post that fastens to the helicopter's floor. This pintle mount, in theory, made sense. It supported the 24-pound weight of the M60 and was supposed to provide a stable firing platform. The reality, as crews immediately discovered, was that it was awful. The pintle mount severely restricted the gun's field of fire. The gunner could only really shoot in a narrow arc to the side of the helicopter. They could not shoot forward to suppress targets in the landing zone as they approached. They could not shoot aft to cover the helicopter as it departed. It was, for all intents and purposes, a useless piece of engineering in a real combat environment. So the crews improvised. They threw out the pintle mounts and grabbed bungee cords. They looped the cords through the cabin ceiling soundproofing, creating a flexible harness. The M60 was clipped into this web of elastic, hanging freely in the doorway. This simple, unofficial modification was a tactical revolution. Suddenly, the gunner had a full 180 degrees of fire. He could lean out and fire forward into the LZ. He could track targets as the helicopter flew past. He could pivot and fire behind the aircraft as it pulled away. The bungee cords absorbed the helicopter's intense vibration, which made the gun slightly more accurate. And just as importantly, they supported the full weight of the gun and its heavy ammunition belts. But this brilliant solution carried a terrible, hidden cost. The pintle mount, for all its flaws, kept the gunner mostly inside the aircraft. The bungee system demanded the opposite. To use it effectively, to get those angles, the gunner had to lean out. He had to physically place his upper body, his shoulders, his head, completely outside the helicopter's airframe, hanging exposed in the wind. The feeling itself was a constant assault on the senses. The gunner would be kneeling or sitting on the edge, the M60's cold metal resting in his hands, the gun itself constantly jigging and vibrating against the tension of the elastic cords. The air, reeking of turbine exhaust and damp, rotting vegetation, would be trying to rip his helmet off. He would be fighting the machine's weight, the wind's pressure, and the helicopter's violent movements, all while trying to find and engage targets. This aggressive, exposed posture made them lethally effective. It also made them the most visible, most obvious, and most vulnerable target the enemy had. They were a human silhouette against the sky, a clear and obvious threat that needed to be eliminated first. The very adaptation that gave them flexibility also signed their death warrant. This trade-off, flexibility versus exposure, was the central, unsolvable problem of the door gunner's job. Every time a gunner leaned out on his bungee cords to protect the troops, he was offering himself as a sacrifice. The NVA and Viet Cong were not stupid. They learned this fast. They saw the man in the door, the one with the big gun, and they aimed for him first. Let us follow a new gunner, Specialist Ray, on his first combat assault. He is 19, straight from Fort Polk, and he thinks he knows how to use an M60. He is sitting on the edge of the Huey's floor, his boots dangling in the slipstream, the bungee cords of his gun creaking slightly with the helicopter's movement. They are flying in a formation of 10, a long, staggered line of green dragonflies against a hazy, humid sky. The first sensation that dominates everything is the noise. It is not just loud. It is a physical entity, a pressure wave that slams into your chest and rattles your teeth. The single Lycoming turbine engine behind him screams a high-pitched, piercing whine. Above him, the two massive rotor blades make the sound that defined the war. A deep, percussive whop-whop that you feel in your gut more than you hear with your ears. The wind, even at this altitude, is a howling, relentless force. It rips at his uniform, fills his nostrils with the thick, cloying smell of JP-4 jet fuel from the exhaust, and mixes it with the damp, earthy scent of the jungle 2,000 feet below. It is beautiful, in a terrifying way. Then the pilot's voice crackles in his helmet, tinny and calm, LZ hot, going in. The beauty vanishes. The helicopter banks hard, and Ray's stomach lurches. He instinctively tightens his grip on the M60's spade handles. He can see the landing zone now, a small, muddy clearing in the endless green, pockmarked with old bomb craters. The artillery has already been in. Columns of gray smoke rise lazily from the tree line, and the air smells like a 4th of July barbecue gone wrong, a mix of burnt vegetation and cordite. The gunships, Cobras, dive in first. He watches them, a separate show, as they unleash rockets that zip away, leaving trails of white smoke, followed by the sound of their miniguns, a terrifying ripping noise, like a giant tearing a phone book in half. Then it is their turn. The slick begins its descent, and the world slows down. The helicopter has to decelerate, has to become a slow, stable platform. The reduction in speed makes the engine noise change pitch, and the wind noise dies down, replaced by a sudden, terrifying sense of vulnerability. "Guns hot," the pilot says. Ray swivels the M60 forward, leans out into the wind, and squeezes the butterfly trigger. The gun explodes in his hands. The recoil is a jarring, physical punch, hammering into his shoulder and arms. The noise of his own gun is deafening, a rapid metallic beep-t that overrides even the rotor blades. Hot, spent casings eject from the side, a stream of glittering brass. They are supposed to be caught by the canvas bag, but one bounces off the bulkhead and falls down the collar of his flak jacket. It is a sharp, searing pain, a small circle of fire against his skin. But he cannot stop. He cannot even flinch. He has to ignore it. He watches his red tracers, every 5th round, float out toward the tree line. They look impossibly slow, like lazy lasers, reaching out to touch the trees. He is not aiming at anything specific. He is just firing, creating a wall of noise and lead. Then he hears it. It is not a boom, not an explosion. It is a crack, a sharp, sudden, intimate noise that snaps past his head. Impulse log in. This is the sound of a bullet passing close by, breaking the sound barrier right next to his ear. It is the sound of someone actively trying to end his life. In that instant, the world shrinks to the size of his helmet. He feels a thud, and a small, perfectly round hole appears in the aluminum skin of the helicopter's cabin, 3 feet from his knee. Just a neat little hole. Daylight on the inside. His mouth is completely dry, a sandy pit that tastes like metal and sweat. His hands are clamped so tight on the M60, he thinks his knuckles will burst through his gloves. He is breathing in short, ragged gasps, and the adrenaline is a cold, electric fire in his veins. Historians still debate whether the psychological trauma of this first, sudden realization of mortality or the slow, grinding, cumulative stress of a full tour was the more damaging psychic wound for flight crews. For Ray, there is no debate. There is only the now, the next 30 seconds. The helicopter settles into its hover just feet off the ground. The infantrymen in the back, their faces green and streaked with sweat, jump out into the mud. They are gone in a flash. For this brief eternity, the Huey is a sitting duck. Ray keeps firing, traversing the gun back and forth, the barrel getting dangerously hot, the smell of burnt gunpowder thick in his throat. He sees muzzle flashes, tiny, winking sparks in the dark tree line. He aims for them. The pilot screams, "Go! Go! Go!" and pulls pitch. The helicopter leaps into the air with a groan, banking so hard Ray is looking straight down at the LZ. The incoming fire continues, snapping and cracking around them as they climb, desperate for altitude, desperate for safety. 10 minutes later, they are back at the base, refueling. Ray's hands are shaking so badly he can barely unclip his harness. The small circular burn on his back is already blistering. The crew chief slaps him on the shoulder, grinning, and hands him a lukewarm canteen. "Welcome to Vietnam, kid," he yells over the engine, spooling down. "First one's free." Ray just nods, his ears ringing, the smell of cordite and his own cold sweat filling his world. He has 11 months and 3 weeks left to go. That brutal initiation, that first taste of a hot landing zone, was a perfect, terrible summary of the door gunners' war. The entire American airmobile doctrine was built on a theory, a beautiful, logical theory of overwhelming firepower. Planners in air-conditioned offices believed that no enemy could withstand the storm. First, the artillery would prep the landing zone. From miles away, 105mm howitzers would rain high explosives onto a set of map coordinates. Then came the gunships. From his orbiting holding pattern, a gunner like Ray would watch them work. A deadly aerial ballet. The AH-1 Cobras, sleek and menacing, would roll in, firing 70mm rockets that left white smoke trails hanging in the humid air, followed by the terrifying, unmistakable sound of their miniguns. It was a sound that veteran gunners described as a giant ripping a sheet of canvas, a solid, vibrating brrr-zist that poured 6,000 rounds a minute into the tree line. The ground would erupt in smoke, fire, and flying dirt. In theory, by the time the slicks, the troop transports, made their final approach, any enemy soldier with a brain would be either dead, wounded, or running. The slicks would just be a taxi service, dropping off troops to mop up. But the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong were not an unthinking mob. They were a patient, adaptive, and ruthless enemy. They learned. They learned to dig in. They learned to wait. The artillery prep, which seemed so devastating, was often just a signal. They had sophisticated bunkers and tunnel systems. A soldier would hear the incoming shells, climb deep into the red earth, and simply wait out the storm. They would sit in the dark, the ground shaking around them, the air thick with dust and the smell of damp soil, feeling the concussions as dull, distant thuds. When the artillery stopped, they knew the gunships were next. They would wait through that too. Then, when the gunships pulled off to rearm, they would climb back to their positions, their AK-47s and RPGs ready. They learned to wait for the slicks. This was the tactical evolution that killed so many door gunners. The NVA learned to hold their fire. They would let the lead helicopter, Chalk 1, land without firing a shot. That pilot, seeing no enemy activity, would radio back, "LZ green. LZ is clear." Then, as Chalk 2, Chalk 3, and Chalk 4 came in, staggered just seconds apart, the NVA would spring the trap. The tree line would explode. This is exactly what happened to Specialist Pina's aircraft. The NVA would position their heavy machine guns, like the DSK, in pre-sighted positions to create a flak trap, a triangulated crossfire that the helicopters had to fly through. They even had an odd and terrifyingly effective tactic of placing soldiers in spider holes. Tiny one-man pits dug right out in the open, in the middle of the landing zone itself, covered with a lid of woven grass. The artillery would blow right over them. A helicopter would descend, thinking the clearing was safe, and a soldier would pop up from the ground, firing an AK-47 or an RPG from point-blank range. Historians still debate whether NVA anti-aircraft doctrine was centrally planned from Hanoi or was a result of this kind of rapid, brutal, field-level adaptation, but the results were undeniable. For the door gunner, this meant the most terrifying moments were not the LZs that were obviously hot, the ones where you were taking fire from 2 miles out. The most terrifying LZs were the ones that were quiet, the quiet ones, the ones that looked safe. The feeling was a cold knot in your stomach. You would be descending, the helicopter slowing, the air getting thick and hot as you got near the ground, the smell of mud and stagnant water rising up to meet you. You would be scanning the tree line, your M60 pointed, your thumb on the trigger, and seeing nothing. Just green, silent, unmoving jungle. This silence was a lie, and when the lie broke, it broke all at once. It would be a single muzzle flash, then another, then the whole jungle would seem to open up. The door gunner's job instantly changed from suppressive fire to target. They were the most visible, most exposed, and most threatening part of the helicopter to the soldiers on the ground, so they were targeted first. The NVA were trained to aim for the gunners, the pilots, and the tail rotor. A single round in the tail rotor drive shaft, and the helicopter would spin uncontrollably out of the sky. The door gunner was in a desperate race. He had to suppress those enemy gunners before they landed a fatal hit. It was a race that lasted 30 seconds, and he was a target in a shooting gallery, a target who could not move, could not hide, and could not stop. So when that quiet, lying jungle finally opened up, what protection did a gunner have? The answer, unfortunately, was almost nothing. He wore a flak vest, officially designated as armor body, fragmentation protective. The key word there, if you are a fan of dark, bureaucratic jokes, is fragmentation. These vests were designed to stop flak, which is bits of shrapnel from exploding artillery or grenades. They were not, and this is a tragically important distinction, designed to stop a direct fire rifle round. This was, of course, cold comfort, as the enemy was not, as a rule, throwing shrapnel. They were shooting bullets, which was just terribly impolite of them. An AK-47 round, traveling at over 2,000 feet per second, would go through a standard flak vest like it was cheesecloth. The vest itself was an instrument of misery. It was filled with thick layers of nylon, and in the 100-degree, 100% humidity environment of Vietnam, it was like wearing a steam-heated quilt. The vests were stiff. They trapped all body heat, and after just 2 weeks in country, they permanently smelled of mildew, stale sweat, and old, sour fear. It was a heavy, hot, and mostly useless burden. Because the flak vest was basically useless against the primary threat, the Army introduced the chicken plate. This was the odd, almost comical detail that underscores the desperation of the problem. The chicken plate was a 22-pound slab of curved ceramic, designed to be worn inside the flak jacket right over the chest. The nickname's origin is unclear. Maybe it was because it only covered an area the size of a large dinner plate. Or perhaps it was a very dark joke about not being chicken. Given that these men were voluntarily flying into machine gun fire, calling them chicken seems a bit rich. The plate itself was a constant, heavy burden. It pressed against the gunner's sternum, a hard, unyielding weight that made breathing feel shallow. When a gunner leaned forward on his M60, the plate's hard edge would dig into his ribs. When he sat back, it felt like a small anvil was pulling him down toward the floor, and it only protected his vital organs from a direct frontal shot. A round from the side, the back, or one that hit his arms, his legs, his neck, or his head, would be just as fatal. Historians still debate whether the massive psychological weight of wearing this heavy, protective gear was more detrimental to crew morale than the very limited ballistic protection it actually offered. It was a trade-off. 22 extra pounds of weight on an already overloaded aircraft, and 22 extra pounds on a man who needed to be fast and flexible, not weighed down by a piece of ceramic hope. This minimal protection was then pitted against the brutal physics of the landing. Remember, the Huey had to slow down. As it approached the LZ, it would decelerate from 100 knots to maybe 10 or 15 knots, just 12 to 17 miles per hour. It would descend at a steady, predictable rate. The entire feeling inside the helicopter changed. The overwhelming roar of the 100-knot wind would lessen, replaced by the deeper, heavier thumping of the rotor blades. The movements would become less jarring and more deliberate, more stable. For the enemy on the ground, this was the golden moment. The helicopter transformed from a fast, difficult target into a large, slow, hovering bullseye. And the door gunner, leaning out on his bungee cords, was the most obvious part of that bullseye. A clear human shape silhouetted against the sky. An AK-47 was bad enough. The DSHK-12, 7mm heavy machine gun, was worse. Its heavy slugs could punch through the helicopter's engine block. But the weapon that truly defined the terror for helicopter crews was the RPG-7. This was the rocket-propelled grenade. It was a simple, shoulder-fired weapon designed to kill tanks. A Huey, made of thin aluminum and plexiglass, is decidedly not a tank. It was like using a sledgehammer to kill a mosquito if the mosquito was carrying 6 of your friends. The gunner would often be the first to see it. It would be a sudden, bright flash from the tree line, followed immediately by a thick, white-gray smoke trail. The rocket itself moved at nearly 300 meters per second, but to the man watching it, it seemed to move in agonizing slow motion. It was a streak of fire and smoke coming right for him. There was nothing to do. He could not run. He could not duck. The pilot could try to bank, but there was almost never enough time. The gunner could only keep firing his M60, his own tracers reaching out, desperately trying to kill the man who had fired the rocket. Even as that rocket closed the distance, when the RPG hit, it was not a simple bullet hole. The warhead was a shaped charge. It was designed to melt its way through 8 inches of tank armor. Against the Huey's thin aluminum skin, the effect was catastrophic. It would detonate on contact, punching through the fuselage and sending a cone of molten metal and shrapnel tearing through the inside of the cabin at thousands of feet per second. The overpressure from the explosion itself was enough to shred the aircraft. For a crew in the Central Highlands in 1969, this was the end. Their Huey Chalk 4 was on final approach when the RPG team fired. The door gunner saw the flash. He even swung his M60 towards it, but he was too late. The rocket struck the helicopter just behind the pilot's door, right in the main cabin. The explosion was instantaneous. It was a blinding white flash, a deafening, skull-crushing bang, and a wave of intense, suffocating heat. The cabin filled with thick, black, oily smoke that smelled of burning fuel and vaporized metal. The helicopter, its controls severed and its structure compromised, simply fell from the sky, tumbling into the trees. The door gunner, who had been leaning out, was gone. The flak jacket, the chicken plate, all of it, was instantly rendered meaningless by the sheer, overwhelming physics of the explosion. If the enemy's rockets did not get you, your own weapon might. The door gunner's entire existence, his entire purpose, was tied to the M60 machine gun. It was his lifeline, his sword, and his shield. It was also, unfortunately, a notoriously temperamental and unreliable piece of equipment. The infantry had nicknamed the M60 the Pig, partly because of its bulky, beast-like appearance, and partly because it was a greedy, demanding weapon that was always hungry for maintenance. But for a door gunner, this was no laughing matter. When your gun went down, you were no longer a gunner. You were just a passenger, a target. The M60 was a complex, gas-operated, belt-fed machine gun. It was a marvel of engineering on a firing range at Fort Benning. In the central highlands of Vietnam, it was a disaster waiting to happen. The problem was the environment. The air was a thick, humid soup, constantly saturated with moisture that corroded metal parts and rotted the canvas ammunition bags. Then there was the dust, a fine, red laterite powder that got into everything. This microscopic grit would work its way into the M60's gas system, its trigger group, and its rotating bolt, grinding against the moving parts like sandpaper. The gun had to be kept meticulously, surgically clean. But in a forward fire base, clean was a relative concept. A gunner would spend hours cleaning his weapon, feeling the oily, solvent-soaked rag slide over the metal, the smell of CLP stinging his nostrils. He would use a toothbrush to scrub the bolt, trying to get every last grain of red dirt out. He would reassemble it, feeling the satisfying, heavy clack as the parts locked together. Then, one 10-minute flight would coat the entire weapon in a fresh layer of fine, gritty dust, undoing all his work. The heat itself was an enemy. In a long firefight, the M60's barrel would become dangerously hot, hot enough to cook off rounds, meaning the heat alone could ignite the gunpowder in a chambered cartridge without the trigger being pulled. This was a terrifying malfunction. Even worse was the runaway gun, where a worn-out sear would fail and the gun would not stop firing until the entire 100-round belt was gone, a screaming, uncontrollable stream of lead. But the most common and most lethal malfunction was the simple jam, a failure to extract. The gun would fire, the bolt would cycle, but the tiny metal claw, the extractor, would fail to pull the spent brass cartridge from the chamber. The next live round would slam into the back of the stuck casing. The result was a sudden, horrifying silence. The gun would go click instead of bang. For the gunner, this was the sound of death. The feeling was a cold, immediate drop in the pit of his stomach. 1 second, he is a god, unleashing 700 rounds a minute. The next, he is a helpless man in a doorway, his weapon a useless 24-pound lump of metal. He is no longer suppressing the enemy. He is no longer a threat. And the enemy, seeing the big gun go silent, knows this. Now, the gunner has to fix it right there, hanging in the open door with bullets cracking past his head. He cannot take cover. He cannot call a timeout. He has to rip his gloves off, his bare hands fumbling with the hot metal. He has to pull back the charging handle, a difficult physical task. Then he has to lift the feed tray cover, a move that exposes the entire inner mechanism to the wind and grit. He has to dig his fingers into the action to pry out the stuck, hot brass casing. The metal is scalding, searing his fingertips, the smell of burnt gunpowder and hot oil filling his face. He is not looking at the tree line. He is not looking for RPGs. His entire world has shrunk to the size of his own gun, his head down, his body exposed, fighting with a piece of jammed brass. Historians still debate whether the M60's deep design flaws or the Army's inadequate maintenance and training programs in the face of an impossible environment were the primary cause of its failures. But for the gunner, that debate was meaningless. All he knew was that his life depended on this machine, and the machine was failing. And then there was the most bizarre and uniquely terrifying flaw. This was the odd detail that lived in the nightmares of every experienced crew chief. The M60 was designed with a quick-change barrel system. The barrel latch was a single, swinging lever on the side of the gun. In theory, a gunner could flip the lever, grab the hot barrel by its handle, and swap it for a fresh one in seconds. The problem was the latch. It swung freely. It was a terrible design. A gunner moving around would catch the latch on his flak jacket, his harness, or the side of the helicopter. He would not even feel it. The latch would flip open. He would then squeeze the trigger to fire, and the entire barrel, glowing hot and weighing several pounds, would simply fall out of the gun and tumble 2,500 feet into the jungle below. The feeling of this happening was indescribable. One moment, you are firing. The next, your gun makes a dull clunk, and you are holding a receiver with no barrel. You are, in that moment, the single most useless person in the entire war. You can only stare in disbelief at the empty space where your barrel used to be, as your crew chief screams at you in words you cannot hear over the rotor wash. Clearing a jam was a race against time. The gunner would fight the stuck round, his knuckles bloody, his skin burning, sweat stinging his eyes. The incoming fire would feel closer, more personal. He would finally get the new belt seated, slam the feed tray down, pull the bolt, and pray. He would squeeze the trigger. The sudden, violent, beautiful BB of the M60 roaring back to life was the best sound in the world. It was the sound of breathing again. But for those 30 seconds, those 60 seconds of silence, he was just a target. So the gunner finally gets his M60 working again, just in time to fly back to base, refuel, rearm, and fly right back into the very same danger. The adrenaline fades, but the numbers do not. By late 1963, the casualty mathematics became unavoidable. The data was a cold, hard, and deeply inconvenient truth that nobody wanted to look at. But the intelligence officers at every aviation unit had to. They tracked the numbers, and what they found was shocking. It was counterintuitive. It seemed, on its face, to be completely wrong. The door gunners, the air crew, were being killed and wounded at rates that exceeded infantry machine gunners on the ground. Think about that for a moment. This seemed impossible. The entire point of a machine gunner on the ground, an infantry M60 man, was to be the enemy's #1 target. They were the high-priority kill. Infantry training instructors back in the States loved to tell new recruits that the life expectancy of a machine gunner in a firefight was about 7 seconds. A terrifying statistic probably invented by a grizzled sergeant who just enjoyed scaring teenagers. But the ground gunner, the grunt, was supposed to be in the most danger. The door gunner was in the air. He was protected by the speed and technological marvel of a multi-million-dollar aircraft. He was supposed to be safer. The numbers, however, did not care about supposed to. The numbers just were. And the reason, when analysts finally pulled their heads out of the sand and looked at it, was brutally simple. It all came down to one word: cover. A machine gunner on the ground, an infantryman, could use the terrain. He could use cover. He could dive into a foxhole. He could get behind a thick, ancient tree. He could set up his gun behind one of those giant, concrete-hard termite mounds that littered the landscape. He could also use concealment, hiding himself in the 5-foot-tall elephant grass or in the deep, dark shadows of the jungle canopy. If the enemy zeroed in on his muzzle flash, he and his assistant gunner could displace. They could grab the pig, the M60, and run 50 meters to an entirely new firing position. He operated as part of a larger unit, a rifle squad that provided mutual support and security. Now, let us imagine the ground gunner's experience for a second. He is lying flat on his stomach, the hot, damp, red earth pressing against him. His entire world smells of clay and his own sweat and the sharp metallic tang of his weapon. When the enemy fires, he feels the dirt kick up near his face, the physical thud of the rounds hitting the termite mound just inches in front of him. He is scared, yes, but he is connected to the ground. He can dig in, make himself a smaller target, become one with the earth. Now, think about the door gunner. He had none of these advantages. Zero. He could not use cover. He was the cover for the troops inside. He could not use concealment. He was literally a human silhouette, framed perfectly in a wide open doorway, silhouetted against the bright sky, a perfect moving target for any soldier on the ground. He could not shift positions. He was locked into a 10 by 6 foot aluminum box. He could not dig in. He was either hanging 1,500 feet in the air or, even worse, hovering 3 feet off the ground, perfectly still. And his movement was, in the critical moments, entirely predictable. The helicopter had to fly in predictable patterns toward known landing zones. The enemy knew where the landing zones were. They knew the helicopters were coming. They just had to wait. The ground gunner could choose his field of fire. The door gunner's field of fire was chosen for him by the pilot, and the enemy knew exactly where that would be. Historians still debate the exact statistical disparity, as casualty records from that time often lumped crew chiefs and gunners together under the single, unhelpful category of air crew. But the anecdotal evidence from commanders at the time was overwhelming. They were losing air crews at a rate that was simply unsustainable. This statistical crisis forced the Army to act, or at least to start studying. By mid-1964, the Army began to formally analyze door gunner tactics in detail. This was a legitimate, if overdue, historical event. They formalized training. They established dedicated door gunner schools. But training, as so many veterans would later attest, could only do so much. You can train a man to hit a target from a moving platform. You can train him to clear a jam under pressure. You cannot, however, train him how to dodge a bullet when he is sitting in an open doorway and has nowhere to go. The fundamental problem was not the training. It was the mission profile. The mission itself was the flaw. Helicopters conducting combat assaults had to fly low. They had to fly slow. They had to hover in or near the landing zone. These requirements, which were the entire point of the whole airmobile strategy, created a fundamental vulnerability that no amount of training or courage could ever eliminate. The gunner felt this vulnerability in his bones on every single flight. It was the feeling of his stomach dropping as the helicopter flared for its landing. It was the metallic, dry taste of fear in his mouth, a taste he could never wash away, no matter how much lukewarm, iodine-laced water he drank from his canteen. He could see the ground rushing up, see the tree line getting closer. He could see, with perfect, terrible clarity, the muzzle flashes winking at him from the trees. Captain Robert Shawley, who commanded a rifle company in the Central Highlands, understood this from the ground. He worked closely with the helicopter crews. In a post-war interview, he described watching the insertions. The helicopters would appear, a line of them, flying in formation. You could see the door gunners, even from a distance. They were clearly visible in the open doors, their M60s extended. As the aircraft descended, you could see the gunners leaning out, firing, desperately trying to cover every possible threat. Then the aircraft would touch down or hover, and the troops would jump. During those final, agonizing seconds, the door gunners were the only thing standing between his men and concentrated enemy fire. They drew fire. They took fire. They died doing it. But they kept his soldiers alive long enough to get boots on the ground. They were the anvil, and the enemy was the hammer, a tough position to be in for any job. The evolution of the enemy's tactics made this already desperate situation progressively worse. The North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong learned from every single engagement. Early in the war, in 1962 and 1963, their response to helicopters was often chaotic. Individual soldiers would fire their AK-47s at the sky, a scary but relatively ineffective form of harassment. But by 1965, and certainly by 1968, they had developed dedicated, sophisticated, and murderously effective anti-aircraft tactics. They had, in essence, gone to school on American air mobility, and they were very fast learners. They positioned heavy machine guns along known helicopter routes. These were the high-traffic valleys and ridgelines that pilots had to use to get from base to the forward landing zones. They pre-positioned RPG-7 teams near any clearing that looked like a potential landing zone. And in Vietnam, that was a lot of clearings. They trained their soldiers relentlessly to lead a moving target, to aim ahead of the helicopter to compensate for its speed. The 12 7mm DSHK heavy machine gun proved to be a particularly deadly tool. This weapon, the rough equivalent to the American .50 caliber Browning, was a monster. It could punch through the helicopter's thin aluminum skin like it was wet cardboard. It had the range, it had the penetration, and it had a rate of fire sufficient to track and destroy moving aircraft. A single one of these rounds could sever a tail boom, shatter the main transmission, or explode a pilot's armored seat. For a door gunner with no armor, a DSAK round did not just wound. It was an annihilating force. The NVA would position these weapons with terrifying intelligence. They would haul the heavy guns up the sides of steep hills, positioning them on peaks that overlooked the valleys. The gunners would wait, concealed under camouflage, for the daily American mail run or resupply flight. They would fire in short, controlled bursts to avoid giving away their position to counter fire. But those bursts were devastatingly effective. The sound of a DS-8K hitting the airframe was completely different from a rifle round. An AK-47 made a crack or a ping. A DSHK round hit with a thump, a deep, concussive punch that you felt in your chest. It was the sound of the helicopter's bones breaking. The RPG-7 added another, even more terrifying dimension of lethality. As crews learned, this anti-tank weapon could destroy a Huey with a single hit. The NVA did not just fire them randomly. They developed tactics. The most effective was the flak trap, a coordinated ambush designed to exploit the helicopters and the door gunners' limitations. It worked like this. A DSHK or other heavy machine gun would open fire from one position, say, a tree line at the far end of the LZ. This was the bait. The American pilot, seeing the tracers, would instinctively bank the helicopter to avoid the fire. The door gunners, as trained, would immediately swing their M60s toward that threat, pouring suppressive fire into the DSHK's muzzle flashes. But this entire maneuver, this predictable, trained reaction, was what the NVA was waiting for. As the helicopter banked, it exposed its other side, its belly, to a second team, an RPG team, hidden in the trees at a 90-degree angle. This team had been waiting, patiently, for this exact moment. They would fire their rocket at the exposed banking helicopter, often at a range of just 100 or 200 meters. The door gunners could not suppress all threats simultaneously. They were focused on the machine gun, the obvious threat, and the rocket would come from a direction they were not even looking. This triangulated fire was devastating. Historians still debate how much of this tactical sophistication was planned and dictated by NVA High Command in Hanoi, or how much was simply the result of smart, experienced local commanders learning, adapting, and sharing what worked. The result, for the gunner, was the same. He was trapped. But the enemy on the outside was not the only thing trying to kill him. He was also sitting next to a bomb. His own ammunition, a door gunner's weapon load, was immense. He typically carried at least 1,000 rounds of 7.62mm ammunition, and sometimes more for a big operation. This ammunition did not just sit in a box. It was often stored in metal cans bolted to the floor, or in long, heavy belts that hung from the cabin ceiling, feeding directly into the M60. This was a lot of metal and gunpowder in a very small, very exposed space. The problem was that this ammunition was itself explosive. And the enemy's ammunition was too. Both sides used tracer rounds, every fifth round in the belt, to help aim. These bullets had a small incendiary component in the base that burned brightly, leaving a visible trail. If an enemy tracer round, or a hot round, came through the open door and struck that 1,000-round supply of ammunition, the result was a catastrophic, instantaneous explosion. Several helicopters were lost this way. The gunner was, quite literally, sitting inches away from his own funeral pyre. He could feel it. He would be kneeling, the heavy, brass-linked belt feeding over his shoulder or through his hands. He could smell the distinct, oily, metallic scent of the rounds. He knew, with a cold, primal certainty, that if a single lucky shot from the ground hit that ammo can he was leaning against, he would not even have time to scream. He would just be gone in a flash of white-hot fire and shrapnel. The entire helicopter would disintegrate. This created a terrible psychological reality. The gunner was not just fighting the enemy. He was fighting his own equipment. He was fighting the very physics of his job. He was surrounded by threats, a web of danger from the outside and the inside. This relentless daily exposure to extreme danger created a psychological impact that was unique, even in the context of war. It was a constant, grinding pressure that medical personnel would eventually, and rather blandly, call combat stress reaction. For the door gunners, it was just the air they breathed. The fundamental problem was that for an infantry soldier, a grunt, the war was often defined by periods of intense, terrifying combat, followed by time in the rear. He might go on a patrol for 5 days, make contact, and then be pulled back to a large fire base, a place with hot food, cold beer, and a relative degree of safety. He had a place to decompress, to mentally separate himself from the danger. The door gunner had no such luxury. His rear area was the air base, a place he only stayed for a few hours to refuel, rearm, and grab a hot, greasy meal before going right back out. For a door gunner, there was no rear and front. There was only the war. Every single flight, every day, was the front line. A so-called safe mission, like flying mail to an outpost, could become a hot landing zone in the time it takes for a single RPG to be fired. The psychological effect of this was profound. The gunner could never, ever relax. He lived in a state of permanent, high-level anxiety. The sound of the Huey's turbine engine spooling up, a sound that civilians back home associated with the 6 o'clock news, was, for him, the sound of the grinder starting its work. He flew multiple missions every single day. The day would start before dawn, with a combat assault inserting troops into a landing zone. Then, a few hours later, it would be a resupply mission, flying loads of ammunition and sea rations, dangling in a cargo net beneath the helicopter. Then, in the afternoon, it would be an extraction, pulling out a wounded soldier or a reconnaissance team. The cycle repeated, day in and day out, for 365 days. The sheer, grinding repetition was a form of psychological torture. The close, intimate quarters of the helicopter cabin made the trauma of casualties infinitely worse. In a ground combat, a soldier might see his comrade get hit 50 yards away. It was a horrifying but distant event. In a Huey, the crew was confined to a space roughly 10 feet by 6 feet. There was no distance. When a door gunner was hit, everyone saw it. The crew chief, sitting on the other side of the cabin, often just 6 feet away, would watch his friend die. He would see the impact, the sudden, shocking spray of red that would paint the bulkhead. He would hear the man's helmet thud against the metal airframe as he slumped in his harness, his M60 swinging uselessly on its bungee cords. The pilot would hear the impact over the intercom, or worse, just hear the sudden, terrible silence from that man's microphone. The infantrymen being transported would witness the horror, packed in, shoulder to shoulder, unable to look away. There was no time to process it. There was no time to grieve. The pilot still had to fly the helicopter. The other gunner still had to keep firing. They would complete the mission, land, and the body would be removed. A replacement, a new 19-year-old, would be waiting to take his place for the next flight, sometimes just an hour later. This trauma was magnified for the crew chiefs. This is a critical and odd detail of the helicopter war. Many door gunners were the crew chiefs. This dual role was a special kind of hell. The crew chief was not just a gunner. He was the aircraft's senior mechanic, responsible for its maintenance. This meant he had an intimate, expert knowledge of every single system on the helicopter. He knew where every hydraulic line ran. He knew where the fuel cells were. He knew which components were armored and which were just thin, painted aluminum. This knowledge, which was supposed to give him mastery over his machine, instead became a source of educated terror. When an AK-47 round pinged off the floor, he did not just hear a noise. He knew, with absolute certainty, that the bullet had passed exactly 6 inches from the main transmission's oil line. When he saw a stream of fluid, a squirter, leaking from the engine compartment, he knew it was hydraulic fluid and not fuel, and he knew they had about 60 seconds of hydraulic control left before the pilot lost the aircraft. Historians still debate whether this deep technical knowledge provided crew chiefs with a greater sense of control or simply amplified their terror. Veterans will tell you it was the latter. They were not just afraid of getting hit. They were afraid of a specific round hitting a specific, unarmored component. And they knew exactly where all of them were. This combination, the lack of a rear area, the intimate, unavoidable trauma of close-quarters casualties, and the educated fear of the crew chiefs, created the psychological grinder. It was a machine designed to break men. They felt it as a constant metallic taste in their mouths. They felt it in the way their jaw was always clenched, their muscles perpetually knotted. And they smelled it, a smell that never left them. It was the smell of hot metal, JP4 fuel, cordite, and beneath it all, the coppery, sickening sweet smell of blood. This grinding psychological pressure and the enemy's evolving tactics finally collided in one epic, terrifying battle that proved, on a massive scale, just how vulnerable the door gunner was. This was the famous battle at Landing Zone X-Ray in the EIA Drang Valley in November 1965. This battle was the first major engagement between regular United States Army forces and the North Vietnamese Army. It was the moment the airmobile concept, the entire theory of flying troops into battle, was put to its ultimate test. The 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, was ordered to conduct a combat assault into a small clearing at the base of the Chupong Mountain. Intelligence indicated NVA units were in the area. This was, perhaps, the understatement of the war. 3 full North Vietnamese regiments, roughly 3,000 soldiers, were in the hills, dug in and waiting. The first wave of 16 Hueys landed successfully. It was quiet, that same deceptive, terrifying quiet. Then, the enemy attacked in force. The NVA, it turned out, had not read the script about them being intimidated by helicopters. They swarmed the small American perimeter. For the helicopter crews, the battle became a non-stop conveyor belt of death. 16 Hueys, one after another, would fly the 34-mile round trip, pick up more troops, and fly right back into the smoking, chaotic landing zone. Every single insertion, every single flight, came under increasingly heavy, increasingly accurate fire. The door gunners on those slicks had a front-row seat to hell. They were flying into a landing zone that was so hot, so completely overrun, that they were landing just meters away from active hand-to-hand combat. They could see the individual NVA soldiers in the tall, yellow elephant grass. They saw the muzzle flashes, not from a few hidden positions, but from hundreds of them. The air was a solid, crisscrossing web of red and green tracers. They kept firing, their M60s becoming so hot the barrels sagged and the paint burned off, the smell of scorched metal mixing with the gunpowder. The air inside the helicopter was a choking, sulphurous fog of gun smoke, sweat, and the metallic, coppery smell of blood from the wounded they were now desperately trying to pull out. Their hands, raw and blistered from the M60's vibration, would be clumsy as they tried to help a wounded man, his blood slick and hot on their gloves. But the most legendary and most insane part of this battle was the performance of the medical evacuation crews, the dust-off flights. These crews flew unarmed Hueys. Think about that. They were not allowed to have M60s in the doors. They were not allowed to have rocket pods. They were medical aircraft, protected by the Geneva Convention, which meant they had large, prominent red crosses painted on their nose and sides. The NVA, of course, seemed to be using these red crosses as convenient aiming points. The Geneva Convention rules, which everyone was supposed to follow, were proving to be a one-sided joke. The door gunners on these medevac birds were often just medics. Their only weapon was their personal sidearm, a pistol or a rifle, which they were technically not even supposed to use. They flew into the absolute worst part of the firefight on purpose, because that is where the wounded were. Captain Ed Freeman and Major Bruce Crandall flew 14 and 22 missions that day, respectively, flying their unarmed slicks into LZ X-ray long after the official Hot LZ designation had shut down all other traffic. They flew in, taking hit after hit, their helicopters literally being torn apart in the air around them. A door gunner on a regular slick, at least, had the M60. He had the power to fight back, to suppress, to do something. The medic or crew chief, sitting in the door of a dust-off, had only one job: to sit there and take it. He had to watch the muzzle flashes, hear the rounds punching through the aluminum skin, a sound like a hammer hitting the fuselage, and pray. He was completely, totally, agonizingly helpless. He could only huddle behind the wounded men he was trying to save, hoping their bodies might stop a bullet meant for him. Historians still debate whether the NVA's decision to engage the 7th Cavalry so fiercely at Ia Drang was a planned, deliberate attempt to test American air mobility, or a tactical blunder that accidentally exposed their own forces to America's overwhelming air power. For the crews, there was no debate. It was just survival. By the end of the 4-day battle, 79 Americans had been killed at LZ X-ray, and 121 were wounded. Helicopter losses and damage were catastrophic. The door gunners and the dust-off crews had done their job. They had kept firing. They had kept flying. They had inserted the reinforcements and extracted the wounded. And they had paid for it, in blood, in aircraft, and in psychological trauma that would last a lifetime. The horrific lessons from battles like Ia Drang and the daily grinding losses from hot landing zones all pointed to one obvious, desperate need: armor. The crews needed more protection. The problem was not that the Army did not know this. Engineers at Bell and at the Army's own aviation labs were working on the problem. They developed various armor kits for the Huey, heavy ceramic plates that could be bolted to the floor, additional armor wings for the pilot and co-pilot seats, and even armored fuel cells that could, in theory, survive small arms fire. But every single one of these solutions ran headlong into the inflexible, unforgiving laws of physics. Adding armor meant adding weight. Adding weight meant reducing payload. And reducing payload, in the strategic calculus of the Vietnam War, was simply unacceptable. This created the impossible choice that defined the door gunner's existence. A commander, sitting in a smoky tent at a forward operating base, had to make this choice every single day. His UH-1H Huey could, on paper, carry 8 fully equipped infantry soldiers, or it could carry 6 soldiers and several hundred pounds of bolted-on armor. What was the choice? To a commander who was screaming for reinforcements, who had a company pinned down and taking casualties, the choice was obvious. He did not want 6 men. He needed 8. He did not just need 8. He needed 16. He needed 32. He needed every single boot on the ground, and he needed them now. The mission always came first. The crews knew this. The door gunners understood this. They knew the priorities. Getting the grunts into the fight mattered more than protecting the crew. Extracting the wounded mattered more than crew safety. So, most of the slick units, the troop carriers, chose capacity. They flew light, which was a bitterly ironic term. They flew without the extra floor armor. They flew knowing, with every fiber of their being, that the thin aluminum skin of their helicopter provided no protection at all. The gunner would sit there, feeling the helicopter's floor vibrate beneath his boots, and he would know that there was nothing, absolutely nothing, between him and the ground below, but a quarter-inch of aluminum and the empty air. The feeling of an overloaded takeoff was a constant, terrifying reminder of this compromise. The pilot would pull pitch, and the helicopter would strain, groaning, fighting to lift off. The single turbine engine would whine, a high-pitched scream of maximum effort. The rotor blades, biting the thick, hot, humid air, would whomp-whomp with a slow, heavy, sluggish beat. The entire aircraft felt heavy. It felt wrong. It would stagger into the air, barely clearing the perimeter fence, and the gunner knew that this slow, wallowing aircraft was the easiest target in the world. He could smell the unburnt jet fuel from the straining engine, a thick, acrid scent that mixed with the hot metal and the sour smell of his own fear. This compromise led to all sorts of desperate, almost superstitious attempts at self-protection, the odd details of a fatalistic war. Crews would scrounge extra flak jackets, the same vests they knew did not stop rifle rounds, and they would layer them on the floor of the helicopter. It was a pathetic, desperate act. They knew, intellectually, it would not stop a .51 caliber round. It probably would not even stop an AK-47 round. But it was something. It was an attempt to exert some small, tiny measure of control over a situation that was, in reality, completely out of their control. It was a ritual, a prayer made of nylon and Kevlar. Historians still debate whether this command-level insistence on payload over protection was a cold, hard strategic necessity, or if it was a costly, short-sighted tactical blunder that led to unnecessarily high aircrew casualties. Did losing an entire, irreplaceable crew of 4, plus their helicopter, to save 10 minutes on an insertion really make sense in the long run? The men flying the missions did not have the luxury of that debate. They were simply the men who had to live and die with the consequences of that choice. The door gunner would sit in his doorway, his chicken plate a heavy, small comfort on his chest, and he would look at the 8 infantrymen crammed into the cabin. He would see their young, scared, sweat-streaked faces, and he would understand. His job was to protect them. The helicopter's job was to transport them. His own survival was, in the grand, terrible equation of the war, a secondary objective. He flew without adequate protection. He flew knowing that every flight could end with a bullet coming up through that unarmored floor, because the mission always came first. He did it anyway. The choice to fly without armor was a tactical one, but it was layered on top of a machine that was already a masterpiece of technical vulnerabilities. The technical vulnerabilities of the Huey itself compounded the crew's exposure in 1,000 different ways. The UH-1 series, the iconic Huey, was a revolutionary aircraft. But it was also a first-generation machine, and it was filled with Achilles' heels. The NVA did not just learn to wait. They learned engineering. They learned exactly where to shoot. The most obvious vulnerability was the rotor system. The large, exposed main rotor, the 2 blades that gave the Huey its distinctive sound, was a huge, spinning target. But the real weak point was the tail rotor. This smaller, vertically mounted set of blades at the end of the long tail boom was the only thing that kept the helicopter from spinning wildly out of control. It countered the torque of the main rotor. A single long drive shaft, like a car's axle, ran the entire length of that thin, aluminum tail boom, connecting the tail rotor to the main transmission. The NVA learned that this drive shaft was a golden target. A single, well-placed round from a DSHK heavy machine gun could sever that spinning shaft. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The gunner would hear it, a sound he would never forget. It was a high-pitched, metallic scree, like a car's transmission tearing itself to pieces, followed by a violent, lurching bang as the shaft broke free. The tail rotor would stop spinning. Instantly, the helicopter's body would obey the laws of physics and begin to rotate, spinning uncontrollably in the opposite direction of the main rotor. The pilot was now just a passenger in a 5,000-pound unguided top. The gunner would be pinned to the side of the cabin by centrifugal force, his M60 useless, as the world outside the door became a terrifying, spinning green blur. He could only hold on, his stomach lurching, the smell of his own vomit in his throat, and pray that the crash did not kill him. The engine was another glaring problem. The Huey's single Lycoming T-53 turbine engine was, for its time, a miracle of power and weight. But it was mounted directly above and behind the pilots, completely exposed to fire from below and behind. Rounds coming up through the cabin floor, the ones that were not stopped by the gunner's scrounged flak jackets, could, and often did, tear right into the engine's hot section or the main transmission. The gunner would feel the change before he heard it. The entire helicopter's vibration, the constant, familiar rattling that he lived with, would suddenly change pitch. It would become a rough, grinding, shaking feeling, a deep shudder that meant the machine was eating itself alive. The pilot's voice would be screaming, "Mayday, mayday, engine failure." And they would begin the terrifying process of auto-rotation, a controlled crash as the pilot tried to use the remaining energy in the spinning rotor blades to land the helicopter without power. For the pilots, the single most terrifying vulnerability was the chin bubble. This was the section of curved plexiglass at their feet, covering the anti-torque pedals. It was designed to give the pilot a clear view of the ground directly below him, essential for landing in tight, jungle clearings. It was also a perfect clear window for incoming bullets. Rounds coming up from the ground would pass through the thin, unprotected plexiglass and strike the pilots in the legs, the groin, or the lower torso, Many pilots were killed or severely wounded this way. Historians still debate whether this design, which prized visibility so highly over protection, was an inevitable compromise for jungle warfare or a major, negligent oversight by Bell's engineers. For the gunners sitting in the back, the pilot's vulnerability was their own. A dead or wounded pilot meant the helicopter was going down. The fuel system was another critical weak point. The Huey carried its JP-4 jet fuel in large, unarmored bladder cells located in the lower center section of the fuselage, right under the main cabin. Enemy fire striking these cells was a constant, lethal threat. A bullet could cause a simple leak, which was bad enough. The gunner would suddenly smell it, the overwhelming gasoline-like stench of raw jet fuel filling the cabin. It was a smell that meant they were now a flying bomb. The air, hot from the engine exhaust, could ignite the vapors at any second. It was a nauseating, terrifying smell, a smell that meant, get on the ground now. Even worse was an enemy tracer round. These incendiary rounds, the same ones the gunners used, were designed to ignite whatever they hit. A single enemy tracer punching into one of those fuel cells would cause an instantaneous, massive explosion. The crew would have no warning. There would be no change in vibration, no mayday call. There would just be a sudden, blinding, white flash, a wave of impossible, all-consuming heat, and the helicopter would simply vanish, tumbling from the sky in a ball of black, oily smoke. The NVA knew all of this. They trained their gunners to aim for these specific, critical, unarmored points. They did not just shoot at the helicopter, they shot at the tail rotor shaft. They shot at the engine compartment. They shot at the chin bubbles. They shot with cold, calculated precision at the exact spots that would turn a multi-million-dollar war machine into a falling wreck, and turn a highly trained crew into a statistic. So who were these men who were being fed into this relentless, high-speed grinder? The psychological preparation for door gunner duty was, to put it mildly, minimal. In fact, it was almost non-existent. Soldiers who were slated to be crew chiefs would go through aircraft maintenance school at Fort Eustis or Fort Rucker. This was a legitimate, highly technical education on how to take apart and reassemble a Huey's complex turbine engine and hydraulic systems. Then, almost as an afterthought, they would spend a few weeks at Oxteau Door Gunner School. This involved basic marksmanship with the M60, aircraft systems familiarity, and some survival procedures. They would shoot at old tires on a dusty range, and maybe, if they were lucky, get to fire the gun from a helicopter flying a lazy circle over a lake. Then they were given their wings, a handshake, and a one-way ticket to Vietnam. This training could not, in any way, replicate the reality. It could not prepare a man for the sound of a bullet, his first bullet, snapping past his head. It could not prepare him for the sight of the man sitting 6 feet away from him being hit. It could not prepare him for the absolute, gut-turning, bowel-loosening terror of descending into a hot landing zone. The real training happened in country, and it was a brutal, one-on-one apprenticeship that usually lasted about a week. The new guy, the FNG or effing new guy, would be paired with a veteran. This veteran was often a 20-year-old who had been in country for a grand total of 3 months. This old man would show him how to really clean the M60, how to waterproof the ammo, how to sit, how to scan, and most importantly, how to not panic. Then, that veteran would get hit, or he would finish his 365-day tour. And the new guy, who was now a grizzled 3-month veteran himself, would take over the training of the next new guy. It was a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle of trauma. This led to a statistic that is, even by the standards of Vietnam, absolutely chilling. In many air cavalry units, especially during the heavy fighting of 1968 and 1969, the door gunner position had a 100% turnover rate every 6 months. Let that sink in. This did not mean everyone was finishing their tour. It meant that, statistically, every single man in that job was either killed, wounded badly enough to be sent home, or rotated out. The position was a revolving door, and the price of entry was high. The men were not stupid. They knew the math. They saw the new faces, and they saw the empty bunks. So, how do you live with that? You develop coping mechanisms. The most common was a brand of humor so dark it was almost black. It was a gallows humor, a way of laughing at the sheer, cosmic absurdity of their situation. A gunner might get a small scratch on his hand, and his buddy would immediately start planning his memorial service, which was just hilarious. This humor was a shield, a way to process the unprocessed, a way to say out loud the things they were all terrified of. Then there were the superstitions, the small personal rituals that became, for many, more important than body armor. This was the odd detail that kept them sane. A man might have a lucky charm, a small, smooth, polished stone he had picked up at base. He would hold it in his hand before every flight, feeling its cold, solid weight, a tiny anchor of reality in a world of chaos. He would rub it with his thumb, the stone warming to his skin. And in that simple, tactile sensation, he found a moment of peace. Other gunners would never, ever fly without a specific, tattered photograph tucked into their helmet liner. Some refused to wear wedding rings on missions, not because they were unfaithful, but because a ring could get caught on the aircraft. Or, in a darker fear, make it harder for the Graves registration team to process their remains if their hands were damaged. These tiny, irrational rituals were the only part of their world they could control. The memorial services, when a crew was lost, became part of this ritual. They would become routine. The men would gather at the unit's makeshift outdoor chapel. The fallen soldier's boots, his rifle, and his helmet would be arranged in a battlefield cross. The first sergeant would call the roll. He would call the names of the living, who would answer, "Here." Then he would call the name of the man who was gone. He would call it 3 times. The silence that followed, a silence filled only with the distant whine of another Huey's turbine, was the loudest sound in Vietnam. Then, that night, the men would go to the equally makeshift enlisted club, a wooden shack with a tin roof. They would drink too much warm, stale-tasting beer, the foam sticking to their lips, the taste bitter and metallic. They would tell stories about the man who was gone. They would laugh. They would get into fights. And the next morning, hungover and hollow-eyed, they would get up and do it all again. Historians and sociologists still debate the long-term psychological impact of this kind of sustained, high-casualty, high-turnover environment. But for the men, there was one other thing that kept them going. It was the relationship between the door gunners and the troops they transported. This was a unique, profound, and mostly unspoken bond. The infantry soldiers, the grunts, respected the helicopter crews in a way they respected few others. When a grunt climbed into a Huey, he was scared, he was hot, he was miserable. But he would look at the door gunner, the kid his own age, hanging in that open door. He saw that gunner leaning out, deliberately exposing himself, taking the fire that was meant for the grunts in the back. He saw the gunner as his guardian, his angel, his shepherd with a very, very loud machine gun. That respect was mutual. The door gunner would look back at the grunts, packed into his helicopter. He saw these kids, their faces painted green and black, their eyes wide with fear, loaded down with 80 pounds of gear. And the gunner knew, with a sinking, respectful dread, that while he was about to fly away from this godforsaken, burning, ant-infested landing zone, these men were about to jump into it. They were going to live there. They were going to fight and bleed and die in the very mud he was about to leave behind. He was their taxi, their lifeline, their only way out. In those 30 terrifying seconds in the landing zone, their fates were perfectly, violently intertwined. The gunner would keep firing, pouring lead into the trees, not just to protect the helicopter, but to protect them, to give them those extra 2 seconds to get off the helicopter and find their first piece of cover. It was a bond forged in shared terror. That bond, forged in terror and mutual respect, was the human engine that kept the airmobile concept running. But by 1968, the machine itself was breaking down. The casualty rates, especially among experienced crew chiefs and gunners, were simply unsustainable. The 100% turnover was not a statistical quirk, it was a logistical nightmare. Units could not maintain qualified personnel. The training pipelines back in the States, even running at full capacity, could not produce replacements fast enough. The entire door gunner program, and by extension the entire airmobile strategy, was under a serious, high-level review. Aviation commanders, faced with a catastrophic loss of experienced crews, proposed solutions. They screamed for better armor. They demanded better weapons. And they experimented with new tactics. Some of these improvements were implemented. The M60E1 variant was introduced, which had some modifications to make it slightly more reliable, though it was still the pig. Helicopter design evolved with the full introduction of the AH-1 Cobra gunship. The Cobra was a sleek, tandem-seat attack helicopter, a shark designed specifically to hunt. It could provide the heavy fire support, the rockets and miniguns, that the Slicks desperately needed. And it did so while keeping its crew relatively protected by armor and a narrow airframe. But the Cobra was not a solution to the door gunner's problem. It was a complement. The Cobra was the killer, but the Huey Slick was still the bus. The infantry still needed to be transported. The wounded still needed to be evacuated. And that meant the Slicks still had to fly into those same hot landing zones, and their door gunners still had to hang in those open doors, providing that last, vital 30 seconds of suppressive fire. The fundamental problem remained completely unsolved. As the American withdrawal from Vietnam began after 1969, the nature of the war changed. Vietnamization, the policy of handing the war over to the South Vietnamese, meant American aviation units flew fewer massive combat assaults. But the missions continued. The resupply flights, the medical evacuations, the hunter-killer teams, all of it continued, right up until the final American withdrawal in 1973. American door gunners continued to fly and continued to die, protecting operations in a war that most of America had already decided was lost. The final numbers are the coldest, hardest answer to the question of why they did not survive. Of the 6,175 total American deaths in helicopter operations, 2,704 were aircrew. These were the door gunners, the crew chiefs, the medics. Over 5,000 helicopters, mostly Hueys, were destroyed. This meant that roughly 42% of all helicopters sent to Vietnam were shot down or damaged beyond repair. The statistical certainty was that if you flew enough missions, your aircraft was going down. The only question was whether you would walk away from the crash. These numbers exist in military archives. They are the answer. But they are not the truth. The truth is that door gunners did not survive Vietnam because they were placed in an impossible tactical situation, a situation that no amount of training or courage could overcome. They were required to operate from open, unarmored doorways on slow-moving, low-flying aircraft. They were required to fly in predictable patterns toward known enemy locations. They were, by design, the highest priority target for an enemy who had time to prepare, who had concealment, and who had weapons specifically effective against helicopters. The mission was designed for effectiveness, not for survival. Their survival was secondary to mission accomplishment. And the most heartbreaking part is that they knew it. Every veteran interviewed, every man who sat in that door, described knowing, with absolute certainty, that their position was the most hazardous on the aircraft. They did it anyway. That is the legacy. The lessons learned from their sacrifice were written in blood, and those lessons would define modern military aviation. The next time you see a UH-60 Blackhawk, the helicopter that replaced the Huey, look closely. It is the physical embodiment of the Huey's failures. The Blackhawk was designed from the ground up to fix the problems that killed so many crews in Vietnam. Its gunners fire M134 miniguns or 50 caliber machine guns from mounts. But they fire from cabin windows, not wide open doors. The crew sits in a ballistic-tolerant, crash-worthy cockpit. The helicopter has redundant systems, armored fuel cells, and advanced radar and missile warning systems. The lessons that the door gunners of Vietnam paid the ultimate tuition for are now standard doctrine. But no amount of modern technology can change what those men did. They flew into hot landing zones, knowing the odds. They provided the suppressive fire that saved countless infantry lives. They protected the dust-off helicopters that rescued thousands of wounded. They died at rates that exceeded almost every other position in the war. They did it for a full year-long tour, mission after mission, day after day, until they were killed, wounded, or finally, miraculously, completed their service. And so, our story of the Vietnam door gunner comes to a close. The constant, deafening roar of the turbine, the percussive, chest-thumping sound of the rotor blades, the high-velocity crack of incoming rounds, all of it can finally begin to fade. The overwhelming noise of the war can ease into the quiet of the night. The red tracers that lit up the dark tree lines have burned out, leaving only the memory and the dark. The tension in the shoulders, the death grip on the M60's spade handles, the constant, vibrating adrenaline, all of it can be released. The gun has cooled. The engines are quiet. The men who flew in those open doors are old now, or they are gone. Their watch is over, and their story, a testament to a specific kind of courage in an impossible situation, is now a part of history. It is a history that we can learn from, that we can honor, and that we can, for tonight, set gently aside. The jungle below is now just a dark, sleeping shadow. The cold wind of the slipstream is gone. The mission is over. You can let go of the weight. There is no more need to scan the tree line, no more need to listen for the sound of danger. All that is left now is the stillness. All that is left is the peace that they fought for, and that you deserve. The story is told. The history is safe, and you are safe. Let the darkness be a comfort, a quiet blanket. Good night. Good night.